Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin and the fact that it has now rallied to a new all-time high in 2025 after sweeping the range low. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. One of the things we've talked a lot about over the last couple of months is the idea that Bitcoin would sweep that range low before going to a new all-time high. And this analysis was mostly just based on what we've seen Bitcoin do time and time again this market cycle. In fact, this is almost a carbon copy of what happened last year around the exact same time, just shifted by 1 month, right? Shifted by about 1 month. Now, back in 2020, late 2023, early 2024, Bitcoin was setting range lows at around 40K, right? It set a range low here in late December, in December, late 2023, and it was at 40K, and it then held 40K as support for a while, but then eventually it swept the prior low and then rallied to a new cycle high. That rally that Bitcoin was able to achieve back then, once it did sweep the range low, it actually rallied up to the higher high structure that had been in place. Okay, so you can pretty clearly see there was this higher high structure, and the second high was just before Bitcoin swept the range low. And it was the third high that took you back up to the trend line once again. Now, in this case, you're seeing something very, very similar play out, where you have the same type of higher high structure, right? And it was after this tag of the trend line that then Bitcoin went down here and swept the range low. So the low was set at 90K. It then held support at 90K a number of times. Then once it swept the range low, it was able to then get a stronger rally. Now, ultimately, the question is, will it play out the same way? If it were to play out the same way, right, which it already has put on a new all-time high, which is certainly a good thing, right? If it were to play out like 2024, then you might expect it to rally back up to this trend line right here. Now, what's interesting is this trend line, if we draw it, as accurately as we can, where we connect the wicks to each other, what you'll notice is that this trend line corresponds to approximately $120,000, 120K, right, for one Bitcoin. The reason why that's interesting is because that's a number we've mentioned a number of times over the last year or two. And one of the reasons we've mentioned it over the last year was because of just making the comparisons between the QQQ launch, the ETF of the QQQ launch, and that of Bitcoin. Now, one of the things that I think you have to keep in mind is that when you're looking at markets and different market cycles, different business cycles, it's easy to look at one analog and say that it looks the same as another. The reason why that often happens and why we fall into that trap is because markets generally go up. So when you compare something going up to something else that's going up, it can look like the exact same thing, even if it's not. But it can look like that. And that's why oftentimes you'll see people draw those correlations. They'll overlay, they'll take sort of a bar chart, a bar pattern, and from a prior point in the cycle, and then overlay it later on, and then say, well, this is what's going to happen. A lot of times it doesn't play out the exact same way. But I only want to follow up on this because this is something we spoke about last March. And I just want to remind people of it and to say, look, it's probably going to deviate soon, and you should be prepared for that deviation. But keep it in the back of your mind in case it becomes relevant. And essentially what I'm talking about is that when the QQQ launched in 1999, it rallied from 48 or so to 120, and it took 54 weeks. 54 weeks to make that rally from 48 to 120. What's interesting is that Bitcoin, if you look at when the spot ETF launched for Bitcoin, Bitcoin found itself at 48K on that wick, right? You can see it, the high for that week was 48K. What's fascinating, and I've mentioned this a lot, is that 54 weeks after the spot ETF launch would be inauguration week, right? Today's inauguration day. We're currently on week 54. So the reason why that's interesting is because there are some interesting things about that, right? You have Gary Gensler's resigning this week. You have a new president coming into office that is, self-described as being pro-crypto. And so you have to wonder, right? Are we living in a simulation, right? Is it playing out in a similar fashion? You have to remember, again, that things can deviate at any moment. But as I said, if Bitcoin were to launch higher to the higher high structure, right? If it were to go to the higher high structure once again, it would actually put it at right around 120K. Now, if you look at the QQQ back then and you try to figure out exactly when it hit 120, I think it was at the end of the week, right? It wasn't on, there wasn't an inauguration back then, right? It was 2000, not 2001, but it actually occurred on it was March 24th, but it occurred on a Friday. So you could argue a couple of things, right? First of all, you could say, well, if it does happen, then maybe you do get 120K later this week, right? If it can play out like the QQQ. You could also argue that with the QQQ, it did technically rally until March, which is also how long Bitcoin rallied last year. So there's part of me that wonders, if it is to repeat the pattern from last year, where it's putting in these higher highs, you could get something similar this year, where it goes to 120 or so around inauguration week, and then it consolidates. But then what if it breaks through that level? And because you can see that last year it then rallied up until March, and then the market cooled off. The QQQ also rallied until March. But it is interesting that it happened to correspond to inauguration day, right? I thought that was an interesting sort of coincidence, if you will. The one thing to keep in mind is that if Bitcoin is not able to rally until March, the one thing to keep in mind is there is such a thing as a left translated cycle. It doesn't have to be your base case, but if you go back to like the 1970s and you look at what happened in the 1970s when we had periods of rising unemployment off and on, and also rising inflationary waves, various inflationary waves, one of the things you'll notice is that there were occasionally left translated cycles, right? So this was a right translated cycle where you just had a 1-year bear market, but you also could see sometimes there were 2-year bear markets because you had a left translated peak. Now, the bottom in all of these market cycles back then occurred in the latter part, I believe, or at least in the midterm year, right? This was October of 1966. This was about May, June of 1970, and then this was September, October of 1974. So the lows always seem to occur in the midterm year. The highs sometimes occur in the post-halving or the post-election year, sometimes even in the midterm year. But there were a couple of times where you had a left-translated peak, right? A left-translated peak. And again, we don't have to see that this cycle, but there is a reason to at least acknowledge it as a possibility, right? Hope for the best, right? Hope that we just get a normal right-translated peak. But if inflation starts to rear its ugly head, or if the unemployment rate starts to go up, there's always a chance that you get a left-translated peak. Now, when those peaks occurred, it either occurred in December of the election year or in January of the post-election year. Well, Bitcoin just set a new all-time high in January of the post-election year. So, in order to deviate from the left translated cycle, what you would need to see Bitcoin do is not only rally back up to this high like it did over here, but to then break through that, right? If it could break through that, then it would be more similar to a normal cycle, right? Where the top is not either at the at the end of the election year or the very, very beginning of the post-election year, right? So that, I think, is the main thing to think about, is that will inflation stay cool enough for long enough for Bitcoin to have a quote unquote normal cycle, right? If you were to look at inflation, we know that it has been moving up recently, but it hasn't really moved up. And when the market did care about it in 1973 and the market topped out, it was when inflation went from like 3.8% to 4.8%. When inflation was just slowly going up, the market didn't care. But it was when it had a big move up, that's when the market cared, and that's what led into a recession. Here today, inflation has been moving higher, but it hasn't really been a big move higher. And because it hasn't been a big move higher, then it's allowed the Fed to not be that hawkish. If inflation were to say go back up to say 3.9%, especially over a single month, that would likely mean that the Fed could actually have to start raising rates again, which is not something any of us want to see. We talked about this a lot over the last few years, is that we would not want to see the Fed cut rates only then have to raise them back up again. In fact, speaking of the QQQ, right, if you go back to the QQQ and we make that comparison, one of the things you'll notice is that back then, the Fed actually they lowered rates, but then they ended up having to raise rates again. And you can't really see it on this chart, but if you were to go to the S&P 500 and look at that same period, right, the dot-com era, one of the things you'll notice is that the Fed had raised rates, right? They had raised rates, and then they lowered them a number of times, but then eventually they had to raise rates all the way up to 6.5%, right? And first they lowered rates right here from 5.5% to 4.75 before then having to raise them back up. That's not what you want to see, right? If inflation starts to accelerate again, then the Fed would likely have to raise rates once again, and that's not really an outcome I think any of us want to see. But it is at least important to note that Bitcoin has put on a new all-time high in 2025, and it's accelerated by 1 month, because this high right here was in January, and then the low was a couple of weeks later. But this high was in December, and then this low was just a few weeks later. So if it were to come back up to this trend line, it could correspond to this month, January, rather than last year it was February, because this cycle, right, or this year seems to be accelerated by about 1 month. Okay. Now, obviously, the QQQ ended up getting a big sell-off on week 55, which would be next week, right? That would be next week. But you have to remember that when the markets do get big sell-offs, there has to be a reason, or there's usually going to be a reason for it, right? I mean, as they say, bull markets don't just end on their own. They get destroyed by something, okay? So if you're going to get a drop like that, there'd have to be something going on. And I don't know what it would be, and it could be many months from now, but it could be one of those things where maybe people start to question if the strategic reserve is going to happen. Whether it happens or not, people might question it if it doesn't happen immediately. That could be a source of it. What's interesting is that even in the case of a left-translated cycle, you could argue that Bitcoin might still be around 100K by Q3, whether it's a right-translated cycle or a left-translated cycle. Because if you get a normal right-translated cycle, and Bitcoin can continue this same trend that it's been doing the last couple of years, then what it does is it moves up in sort of Q4 and Q1, and then consolidates, drops into Q3, right? So up and then down, right? Up and then down. If it's a right translated cycle, then you might just get a move up followed by a bleed back down by August, which is coincidental because by August, this trend line would be right around 100K. So, and that would also correspond to the weekly RSI, right? If you look at the weekly RSI, Bitcoin has been hitting that level in Q3 of both 2023 and 2024. So if it does it again in Q3 of 2025, it might correspond to Bitcoin dropping back down to 100K, but say by the third quarter of this year. If, on the other hand, we get a left translated cycle and something like the QQQ happens where Bitcoin gets this massive drop, even in that case, when it went to 120, it went all the way back down to 63. It went back up to 100 by Q3. So you could argue that whether the path is this or whether the path is this, there's a decent chance that Bitcoin might still be around 100K by the third quarter of the year. So if you're overly concerned about a left translated cycle, there's a decent chance that it won't be obvious until the fourth quarter of this year, right? And this would essentially correspond, a left translated cycle would essentially correspond to Bitcoin not able to durably break through the 1.618 fib, right? So like if Bitcoin, it's already above it, but if it can't really make the next move up to say 150, then it could always come back down here, back test sort of where it broke out from, and then move higher. There was, back over here when it hit this fib extension, it actually pulled back down to the 786 a number of times before then moving higher. So if Bitcoin cannot break through here and it comes back down to this level, then you probably would see a big bounce off of that level. And that's why I'm saying, right, even in the case where a left translated peak happens, it likely would not be obvious until the fourth quarter of the year, because a lot of people would be expecting that in Q4 the market would go up again, just like it did in 2023 and just like it did in 2024, right? So that's my understanding of the market. And here's the thing, right? A lot of people can make fun all they want about looking at different scenarios, and I've seen many of them do it, and they'll call me out and sort of laugh. But here's the thing. Every single one of them have made so many bold calls over the last couple of years, and many of them were wrong, right? And you have to remember that we all get things wrong, including me, right? It's just that it's not about predicting exactly what's going to happen. Think about all the people that called for alt season over the last couple of years. They were wrong, right? Everyone who said that Bitcoin dominance was going to drop in 2022, 2023, and 2024, they were all wrong. But that doesn't stop them from laughing at other people now, right? Because they were a broken clock. They finally got something right. Therefore, they're going to lash out. This is what I would say. It's important to remember that no one knows what is going to happen. Even the people that speak the most confidently to you. Because if you go back and look at any of their prior calls, for the most part, they're wrong. Because no one can predict the future. So if you have a problem with outlining different scenarios, that's your problem, not mine. No one knows what's going to happen. The market will likely do exactly what people think it's not going to do. That's how markets normally play out. They don't normally play out because someone was able to predict exactly what was going to happen. And the people that do predict it probably were calling for it many, many times before it actually happened. So remember, no one knows how the market will play out. I'm outlining these two main scenarios, a right translated peak versus a left translated peak, to say, look, we can't know yet if it's going to be a left translated cycle like 1972 and 1976. We can't know that. But we could say that if it is a left translated cycle, Bitcoin would probably still be doing somewhat okay even by the third quarter, even if it drops back down to where it was last year and then bounces first. And if it's a right translated cycle, then Bitcoin should have no problem just repeating what it did last year, right? Where it just rallies back up to the higher high structure and then eventually breaks through. But if it rallies back up to the higher high structure or does not even make it there, let's just say it sweeps this high, kind of like it did in 2023 when the 10-year yield was also going up, right? If it just sweeps the high but doesn't actually get that next move, it's always possible Bitcoin just gives back those gains, consolidates in Q3, and then goes up. That's what happened in 2023 when the 10-year yield also had a pretty big move. Right, that was when the 10-year yield was going through this move right here, kind of similar to what the 10-year yield is doing today. So please remember that, people are going to say all sorts of things. They'll laugh and whatnot. But ask yourself this. How many of those people were bullish on Bitcoin dominance in 2022, 2023, and 2024? How many of them called for alt season? So many. And now, some of the alts are doing well. But if you had just waited for Bitcoin dominance to hit 60% before diversifying in November, you saw the same upside they saw for most of these alts without sitting in a bleeding altcoin for the last 3 years. And that is a fact, whether they want to admit it or not. So, in this case, what you should look for is, can Bitcoin get above this level in any durable fashion? If it can, if we see Bitcoin at 110K, if it can get, say, like 109, 110K, and get a daily close there, then it would certainly favor Bitcoin going up to this higher high structure once again, around 120K. If it does that, the QQQ comparison in terms of the upside will be complete. If that plays out and Bitcoin is not able to get through that trend line like it did last year, then the odds of a left translated cycle go up. If Bitcoin can get through that trend line like it did last year, then the odds of a right translated cycle go up. You could have a scenario where it doesn't go up there, but just kind of stays around these levels for a while. But even in that case, right, even in the case where it repeats 2023, which doesn't even seem like the most likely outcome at this moment, even in that case where it had sort of a range low as well, right? It had a range low as well. And after sweeping the range low right here, it went to some new highs. Even in that case where it gave back all the gains, it first went below the range low for 2 weeks before getting that big drop. Right? So if all Bitcoin does is just kind of like poke its head above this level, but it's not able to really make that move, and then it comes back down here, there's a good chance it would consolidate right around 90K for a while before getting a move back down. So there's so many different outcomes, and a lot of people will mock that type of analysis, right? Where you're looking at multiple outcomes. But remember, no one knows what's going to happen. And the people that do, all you have to do is scroll back 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and you'll see they were wrong about how, most of the time, how this market played out. How many of them told you back in March of 2024 that it was a mid-cycle top that would last for about 6 to 9 months, like we did over here? How many of them did? I don't know of any, or at least not many. They were all calling for new all-time highs back over there. But if you looked at what happened in 2019 and compared it to 2024, it was the exact same thing. Bitcoin also dropped going into rate cuts last cycle as well, and it led to an extended consolidation phase. So it made sense to assume that was a mid-cycle top because gold was also breaking out. I get things wrong all the time. I admit when I do. I just get really frustrated when people that don't admit it lash out. And that's, I think, where I'm coming from on a lot of this stuff with these videos, is that people need to take more self-accountability and stop calling others out and focus on what they're doing, right? Because then I get these, I get bombarded by people saying, hey, this person said this about you. Guys, let's just stay in our own lane and focus on what we're good at. That's what I'm trying to do. But I'll go ahead and wrap it up there. And I think that, my thoughts are there for you to look at if you're curious. And that's how I'm going to be playing this cycle, right? I stick to the risk levels. This is all dubious speculation, right? I don't know what's going to happen. I stick to the risk levels. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. And again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.